Hey, and welcome to this episode of Build versus Buy, a 30-minute conversation with product and engineering leaders about situations during their career where they've had to decide whether to build or buy. If you'd like to be a guest, reach out to me at Mang-Git@useanvil.com. That's MANGGIT@useanvil.com. If you enjoy this podcast, please like and subscribe on YouTube or leave us a rating/review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Enjoy this episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Build vs. Buy podcast. I am your host, Mang-Git Ng, founder and CEO of Anvil, the fastest way to build software for documents. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Vincent Paquet. He is the Chief Product Officer at Dialpad. Welcome, Vincent.
Thanks, Mang-Git. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I know, Vincent, you and I go way back. I was at Dialpad back when it was still called FireSpotter Labs. I think those emails still work when, as you told me, not pretty recently.
They do. And yeah, you were actually at Dialpad before me. That's pretty rare those days since it's been there for about 11 years as of now.
Been a long time.
Great to catch up.
Yeah, maybe we can start with a quick introduction of yourself and a introduction of Dialpad and what Dialpad does.
Yeah, so Dialpad, we're a customer intelligence platform. Think of it as a way to manage all your communications with your customers. We started, as I mentioned, about a little over 11 years ago. First, as a provider of cloud communication, think of it as a cloud business phone system, and then realized that it was really important to give our customers like a full picture of their relations with their own customers. And so we extended into the contact center world and then in the sales intelligence world. So our goal, which is what we do today, is really to give our customers a complete platform to manage all their business communication across all types of channels. So phone, meetings, omni-channel. And I've been in the space for quite a while, actually, over 25 years now. And as background, I used to work for a startup that was one of the first providers of internet telephony. We got acquired by Yahoo and became the service that powered Yahoo Messenger with voice. Then I left with Craig Walker and started a company called Grand Central and got acquired by Google. And the service became known as Google Voice. And then I left Google to join Craig at Dialpad. And so now we're basically we started Dialpad as a kind of a business version of Google Voice, and it's now expanded into being a much bigger platform, as I described earlier.
I remember when I was still there, the big launch that we had was Uber Conference, which is like this first conferencing system where you can see multiple people dial in, and there's a really cool hold music that our founder Alex created. So I think that got us a lot of press. That was a lot of fun back in the day. And now when I go to your website, it's AI everywhere, and we can definitely want to touch on the AI a little bit that you guys have. I think it's pretty unique and interesting, but also you guys have contact centers and just at scale telephony, which is very different from the early days when I was there. So it's been pretty cool to see the journey.
Yeah, that service is still here. It's now called Dialpad Meetings. And so it's actually like being used every day by hundreds of thousands of users. All the work you did back then, my friend, is still being used today.
Oh, if my code is still in that code base, we're going to have a discussion after this. Cool. That's really awesome to hear. I know you and Craig both have really deep expertise in the kind of telecommunications space. I always joke that this is Craig's third startup of the same company. It feels he's always starting something in the telephony space. But yeah, I would love to pivot a little bit and just go into the real meat of today's conversation, which is build versus buy. And would love to maybe set the scene a little bit. Which company was it where you were making this decision? What role were you in? And then we can go straight into what the product was, thought process, and if you want to share whether it was a build versus buy, we can talk about that as well.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting topic. And I remember thinking that we have more than a few examples of when we had to decide between those two options recently. If you think about it as a startup and even as a slightly larger company now, that that question happens fairly often. And it's really often like difficult to understand what is it that makes something worth buying as opposed to what is it that makes it worth building yourself. And in general, my personal way of looking at it is really based on how core it is to the end user experience.
Hmm.
And if the feature of like the business you're trying to build is critical to the user experience, in my experience, there is almost no chance that you will have the same level of control over that user experience with something that you buy than with something that you acquire. And we've done both in many cases. And what's interesting is I can't think of one single case where you don't run into issues in terms of how much you can customize the end user experience.
Hmm.
And if you stop with the assumption that at some point you will hit those barriers, it becomes really important to understand whether that feature is actually core to the end user experience.
Hmm.
Because if it's not, then the lack of customization or the lack of being able to build it the way you want is less important for you. But if it is, then you end up basically at the mercy of another company for something that is core to the end user experience. And obviously, we're a product company. So for us, it's very critical to produce an end user experience that hopefully will delight the end user.
Yeah.
And so it's hard enough with something you control. So think about the added complexity of having to do it with a software you don't control.
And
Um,
I guess like maybe digging into that a little bit, what is a framework you use to decide if something is core to your user experience and what is not? I think this is a pretty gray area. There, two smart people can disagree on whether something is core to your end user experience. So how do you make that decision, and or how do you think through that decision process?
Interestingly enough, not only two users or two people can disagree, but two companies can have the very different opinion as to what the core of the user experience is. There's tons of examples around on how things can be done differently. There's a lot of companies, a lot of places where people have come to externalize a lot of their processes. And if you think about the car industry is an interesting one because in many respects, a lot of car manufacturers have become system integrators in the last decades. And then comes someone like Tesla who decides that every little bit of the experience in the car is core to your experience as a
Yeah.
user. And they think does make a huge difference whether they can do it themselves or whether they're going to subcontract it out. So I think it's a bit the same in the software world. I think I would say, how anal you are about the end user experience is probably the first gauge of where that barrier is going to be. And
Hmm.
the more anal you are about the control and the of that end user experience, probably the farther or the bigger your core will become. Because defining what that core user experience is will become much bigger. Because you think of if you think about it, at the end of the day, the experience is the whole thing from the minute the people like sign up for your service to
Hmm.
the moment they use it every day, the moment they get support. And so it applies to every single aspect of your business. You could
Yeah.
the same way think about even the customer support experience is going to be very different, whether you outsource it to a BPO or whether you think, look, these are my customers. I want to be in control of the people who actually talk to my customers. And I want to make sure that they're not going to be people who in the morning talk to someone else and then in the
Hmm.
afternoon represent another company or may change every week. To me, I think the way I support my customers is critical to the user experience. and I may want to do that myself. At Dialpad, we do that. We have our own support team and we don't outsource that experience. I think it's a really good question. And in our case, I think what we think of core to the end user experience is fairly large
Hmm.
because we almost think of everything related to how people interact with Dialpad as the core user experience. And so in practice, there's very little thing with outsource.
Yeah. I feel like
Uh,
that was innate to the company's DNA from the early days. Right now, just talking about Alex again, he was such
yeah.
a dynamic and flexible designer. He would do design, he would do music, he would do all these things that really played into the brand, the public brand of Dialpad and Firespotter Labs. But there must be some trade-off, right? Like when your surface area that you consider core to the business is so large, what is that trade-off that you're making in order to cover that kind of surface area?
Yeah, it's a good question again. I think the trade-off is really obviously that you're gonna need to not only build it, but maintain it. You have to have the skill sets, the right people to be able to do both.
Mhm,
And you have to be able to make sure that the ongoing work and investment is actually worth it. So it's definitely an important aspect in understanding what's the long term, what's the ongoing costs of maintaining that piece of software or that experience, and
mhm.
making sure that you don't sign yourself up for something that's not going to make sense. As you mentioned, in our space, we think it's definitely very much ingrained in our DNA. Like we're in a space where we see a lot of our competitors using third-party platform like Twilio and others to complete calls. And if you think about the call quality, the end user experience, the time it takes to set up your call, the
Mhm,
ability to make sure it works across the world, like we think this is super, super critical. And then 10 millisecond difference in how you connect your call, how you set them up, or even on latency does make a big difference. And so for us, it's really important to be in control of that.
yeah,
And
definitely
and
on
I think
latency.
what
I
was
mean,
that?
is it definitely on latency. Imagine if there's a 10 millisecond or more latency aspect to a video call, to a phone call, you just end up talking over each other, and we've all been there. It's very frustrating. Maybe let's pivot a little bit to the specific situation where Dialpad and you specifically had to think through this build versus buy question. I know we mentioned one at the beginning of before we started recording the show, so we'd love to dive into that now.
Yeah. That's actually super relevant because the example that came to mind when we were discussing is a company we ended up acquiring. So I'm killing the suspense here because we now know the outcome, but it's a perfect example of something that was far from being something we would have thought of as our core user
Hmm.
experience when we looked at it. But the minute we looked at it, we were like, okay, we know that is going to become the de facto standard for our industry. And so that company is actually a company called TalkIQ. We acquired it 6 years ago, and it allows us to do, it's basically an AI company that allows us to do real time transcription of every call and meeting on Dive. And what's interesting, by the way, is that we're now at the time where AI is the word of the day. Everyone has an AI strategy, but we've basically been doing it for the past 6 years. And what's good on this front is that we spent the last probably 5 of the last 6 years still trying to convince people about the benefit of AI. Those
Hmm.
days we don't have to do that. But back to how that relates to this podcast is that you see a lot of the people in our industry, whether competitors or elsewhere, today have an AI strategy. And what that really means in practice is they have an API call to OpenAI and they basically use a third party to provide some level of AI. Obviously, this is a perfect example of something where, like, even 6 years ago, when we first started looking into it, we realized this was going to be a critical piece of the core user experience. The demo we saw at the time was the ability to transcribe a call in real time and then basically assist the caller during the meeting. So I'll give you a
Mm,
couple of examples of features we have today so that you can understand what that means. But think of a sales rep today. Most sales rep have what's called a playbook. So
yeah.
think of them as notes that you have prior to your call of things you want to cover during your discussion. And
Mhm.
most good sales rep will know, depending on the type of call, whether it's a discovery call, qualification, or whatever, will make notes and on things they want to make sure they cover during the call. Unfortunately, not everyone does that. And in practice, it's a really good skill set to have because it helps you be dramatically more effective during a call.
Yeah.
And so this is something that AI can let you do very well. So you can create a playbook for your sales reps and it displays during the call. And as they cover one of the topics that they've listed, you can see the topic being checked and then the answer from the contact being actually summarized. So think of the value of having this on every single call, not only checked as it happens, but then it's being logged automatically in Salesforce,
Yeah.
which you now get to another of the frustration of many sales manager is the lack of information in Salesforce. And I'm sure if you've ever done sale, like taking notes after a call is not the most interesting aspect of your job. It's time consuming. It takes you away from calling or talking to more customers.
Mhm.
And so a lot of people don't necessarily have the discipline to do it.
Yeah.
This is a perfect example of something AI can do for you, right? And so today we do that on every single call. So think about a feature like this. If we were to rely on third party to do A, the transcription, B, the
Mhm.
summarization, C, there's no one else who does have an AI playbook in the market, right? There are some features we have that others do. The real time transcription is something that does exist elsewhere. Even if most people do it post call, there are a number of providers that would let you do it during the call. There's a number of people who help you do summarization. Obviously, ChatGPT does that and they can do it for you. You have a number of features you could technically buy from third party providers, but there's also some that just don't exist because you don't own the platform. So for us,
Mhm.
this is a perfect example of something where the fact that we own makes things dramatically different. A, the quality of what we provide is much higher. We have the largest data set in the industry. We've transcribed over 7 billion minutes of real time communications. Not only do we do more accurate transcription, but we also do more accurate summaries. And
Yeah.
that allows us now to produce things like this AI playbook, which no one else does, right? This is an example of a completely innovative features that we would not be able to do if we didn't own the engine.
Yeah, in some ways, I feel like a lot of people think of these pre-trained LLMs provided by third parties are like infrastructure to this new software reality. And they all these integrators that are integrating these existing LLMs into their product are that's like baseline. And they have to figure out ways to differentiate on top of that. But what I'm hearing from you is that by owning the underlying models, owning the underlying technology, you actually can, because your infrastructure, you own the infrastructure and you have ways to modify it to work specifically for Dialpad's use cases, you can provide a much better experience on top of that. And that things that other people couldn't even do because they don't own the underlying models that like you guys do. Is that
Sure.
accurate?
I'll give you another example to make it very concrete.
Yeah.
Obviously, the quality of a transcript matters a lot, right? Think
Hmm.
about every feature you're going to build that's AI driven relies on how well you've transcribed the call or the meeting you're on.
Yeah.
So when people think about the quality of a transcription, they think about something called word error rate, which is
Hmm.
basically what percentage of the words you get wrong. And so
Hmm.
there's data in the industry to show that you have to be at least above 80% accuracy, as in below 20% word error rate to make things like decent
Yeah.
quality. And then you go up from there. So like everyone else, we do that. But what people forget is that there's another aspect that is almost as critical to the quality of a transcript is its readability. And if you think about it, if you don't own the transcription engine, the way you would do that is you connect to a third party transcription engine.
Hmm.
It's it basically connects to your call as a silent participant and then transcribes it. The first thing it has to do is called speaker diarization, which is it has to figure out who's talking at any given time. So on a two people call, it gets decently accurate. There's ways to also use the zero channel to give pointers to get transcription so that you get fairly good accuracy. But the minute you go into a meeting with, say, four, five, or more people, it becomes literally impossible to do
Yeah.
this well. And as a result, you get a transcript that cannot accurately reflect who said what. And so, if the feature you build on top of this are things like purchase intent, are things
Hmm.
like the AI playbook I just mentioned, where you're trying to summarize the answer of the customer, and you have the customer wrongly assigned in your transcript,
Right.
it's literally unusable. In the case of Dialpad, because we own that engine, we actually transcribe each single call leg separately. So if you have 70 people dialing into your call, we
Hmm.
have a transcription engine. Basically, we have the audio feed for each leg of this call individually, meaning we have 100% accuracy on speaker identification. Perfect example of something we would never be able to do if we didn't have our own AI transcription.
Yeah, interesting. It's in some ways by owning you that you touched on like owning the AI transcription level, but you also own the kind of like the communication layer.
Correct.
Is that what it's called? Eventually the cloud
PBX,
PBX, right?
PBX
Um,
is the word your parents used to use,
that's what we
but
called it when I was at FireSpotter Labs 12
yeah,
years ago. But because you own each audio channel coming in, you
yeah,
solve a lot of the challenges that would arise where you're trying to disentangle multiple channels instead of just going to the root source to begin with. And again,
yeah.
that feeding that into your real-time transcription engine just improves the quality that much more than having relying on a third party.
Yeah. So what's interesting is going back to your initial question is if you think about us as a company in the communication space, like AI would have been the last thing that I would think of as being part of the core user experience.
Mm,
But that changed literally the day we saw that demo. And
mm,
what was interesting is, as I mentioned, I used to be at Google. And when we launched Google Voice, we had one of the first voicemail transcription ever available on a widely available consumer basis. And today you tend to take it for granted, but back then, like there was no other way to listen to a voicemail than to actually listen to the voicemail. And I remember when we launched it, this was this amazing leap where suddenly people were like, oh my gosh, how did I do before that? Like you can literally read the message, pick up the phone number and call back
yeah.
without having to even listen to the message. That was amazing. And so fast forward when 6 years ago we saw its first demo of Talk IQ, where they could do the same for a phone call, like literally within an hour, you suddenly realize that, look, this is going to become the future of our phone call. Because
Hmm.
think about an organization, any business has a fairly good visibility on the way their people communicate with the rest of the world except phone calls. It used to
Hmm.
be what we call the last offline data set, where it was a black box. No one knew what people say. And it was purely relying on A, what people would remember. And as we know, recollection is
Yeah.
very unreliable. And then as to what people would share on top of it, which made it very difficult to actually benefit from. And but if you now think of every meeting, every call being transcribed, where you can search your calls for an information, like the power of this information is massive, right? Think of it
Yeah.
like I'm a product guy. I like to use this example and hopefully it will resonate with you and all product people out there. But if you think of you launch a new feature. You want to know what's the feedback from your customers. In the past, I would have to go to a support team and say, hey, so we launch feature A.
Mm.
What's the feedback you're getting? And then I would get literally random feedback and very little actionable one. The memory bias means people would only give me example from the last 2 days, right? So it would
Yeah.
be fairly specific and then whatever they could remember. So I had something that was very isolated.
Mhm.
Today, I can literally go to our contact center, enter the name of that feature, and see on the graph how many times does it get mentioned during call, whether it peaks after the feature launch or whether it drops over time, whether it keeps going up and down. I can literally produce the list of calls with that feature name, read the transcript, and in 2 hours, I get a really good idea of the feedback of the market, right?
Mhm.
Think of the same use case for your sales team. Like you want to know if competitor A comes up on your phone calls very often. You can literally search across all your sales rep phone call, see how often that competitor name comes up. And then you can see the trend, whether they come up more today than they used to a year ago, or whether they come up less. So the power of that data is immense. And so back to that demo 6 years ago, this is the kind of thing where suddenly you're like, okay, what we thought was going to be our core user experience is suddenly completely different. And we
Yeah.
expanded it to say, look, this is going to be the future. You have to be able to provide that additional level of information and knowledge around your call and meetings. And by the way, this is only the start because as we know, like the number of features you can provide around AI is just limitless.
Yeah. It feels like by having a written version of this audio data set, you enable a level of consistency. I guess you can build structured models on top of that. Say, hey,
Exactly.
instead of relying on a person verbally telling you in their own kind of construct and how they think about the problem, you can actually take the transcript, run it through the model, and organize it the way that makes sense to you as a product person. And it eliminates the recency bias that you just alluded to, which is if I'm talking about a feature and I just got yelled at by a customer for that feature versus a customer was raving about it, that memory probably sits more to the forefront of your head and your how you feel about it than one from two weeks ago. So that is pretty cool.
Well,
I think. Oh, go ahead.
no, I was going to say actually, the example around structured data is a perfect example of how impactful this can be. So,
Hmm.
perfect example if you were, say, on your sales calls, you need to know what budget people have,
Hmm.
right? And in the past, you would need every sales rep after each discovery call to take down notes. And then, if you want to be able to structure that data, you would create a field in Salesforce or whatever your CRM is, where
Yeah.
you put either a number or a bracket of number so
Hmm.
that you have the budget somewhere in Salesforce so that you can then do searches on that data and say, hey, show me all the companies with a budget between X and X, right?
Yeah.
Think about the steps that you had to go through to be able to go from language, which is by definition unstructured, to structured data in your CRM.
Hmm.
Like this required literally like 5 different steps that involved a lot of people.
Yeah.
With AI and with transcription, you don't even need to go through that structured conversion. You
Hmm.
can literally search the unstructured data and you
Yeah.
can ask AI now, hey, find me all the companies with a budget above, I don't know, $50 million. And
Yeah.
you would be able to get that search done without having to get the data structured in the first place or without having to search it in Salesforce. So think about how
Yeah.
powerful that is.
It's fascinating because it turns out that the problem is language, I feel like. Because with
Because we
Anvil,
don't computers.
we don't talk in exact sentences. With Anvil, we had the same realization. We just launched a new feature called interactive signing, which allows you to fill out a PDF or fill out a form or contract as you're signing. And there are other solutions out there today, but the underlying PDF is actually a coordinate-based system. It's a visual representation of text in a drawing kind of file format, which removes all of the structure out of the data. And so when we were building this interactive signing experience, we actually keep the data that's being typed into the PDF as a separate piece of information that's associated with the actual underlying document. So that data can then be piped into Salesforce, for example, right? It's very
Yeah,
important for contracts. So it turns out language is the problem.
is the problem.
Language
It's
is the
also the
problem.
solution though.
Yeah. So actually, one thing that I do want to touch on a little bit more is when you saw this demo 6 years ago, it feels like there was a little bit of a dogmatic leap of faith once you saw that to say, oh, this is going to be the future. I think it's obvious now. Everybody's talking about how generative AI can change how we work, how we interact. But 6 years ago, as you mentioned and alluded to earlier in the podcast, you were trying to sell people on this. You were trying to explain to people why this is important. And somehow you and the Dialpad team saw that ahead of everybody else and then decided that it was core to your user experience, your business. Do you think that sometimes the build versus buy decision just requires a little bit of a dogmatic belief, or how do you overcome that?
I actually think it's very much tied to the context you're in. And
Mhm,
I would love to take credit for a lot of pre-science, but I also think that, to be brutally honest, like when you're in the Bay Area and when you're in the tech world,
mhm,
you tend to, you are by definition ahead of where the main market is. And
mhm,
so you tend to see things or be exposed to things that are fairly advanced, but enough, you get exposed to them enough that they don't seem far fetched. And
mhm,
so there are things that you think are actually much closer widespread acceptance than they really are, just because you're in that microcosm that is much more exposed to it. So
yeah,
a long way to say that I think it's easy to take credit for where you are the same way as where you're born. But in practice, it's like, it's funny because you will relate to that. If you recall, like the early days of Dialpad, we were still trying to convince people about the cloud.
right,
And then 10 years later, like no one disputes that. Even if you look at the market of specifically communication, you mentioned PBX, like the number
mhm,
of on-prem PBX is still mind-boggling. If you look at where the most of the market is, it's still like barely there, but at least no one, especially since COVID, no one dispute that the cloud is where everyone will be at some point. And I think AI is a bit of the same, where when we started, we spent the last 5 years trying to convince people that this was the future. And
mhm,
now, thanks to OpenAI and others, I think no one doubts it. But in practice, the volume around it, the volume of talk around it is dramatically bigger than the amount of usage varies.
yeah,
And what's interesting is, even like when we show customers like the amount of revenue we generate from it, we realize that this is far beyond what any of our competitors have, because most of them have slide deck and
yeah,
pretend that this is the future, but none of that is built. At least the value of what we have today is that it is being used and paid for by customers. But the 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 bottom line is that um, it's still a very small segment of the market, which is
mhm,
what is great for us because the potential is now
yeah.
like almost unlimited.
I think companies and kind of technology has become part of the lexicon, part of the media landscape far
Yeah.
faster than actual adoption,
Ex-
right? DocuSign is definitely like a leader in the e-signature space, and it was even featured in the Bear multiple times. I noticed that, but the real competitor to e-signatures or DocuSign isn't another e-signature provider. It's actually wet signing, it's printing, it's emailing, it's all of these kind of legacy processes. And in a lot of ways, when we started Anvil, it felt like we had this idea that we can move off of paperwork, move off of PDFs. And we're at the point where we're like, it's going to take at least another 20 years, 30 years for anybody to consider PDFs to be a legacy file format that we wouldn't use. So we might as well embrace it and then be there for the transition, be there for that bridging mechanism from the old to the new, so that when we're in the new world, people are already aware of Anvil. Totally see that on my regular basis as well. I do want to touch on this last piece before we wrap up here, which is you mentioned Talk IQ. You acquired Talk IQ back 6 years ago, and I assume you would categorize that as a buy, right? You bought the company, but at the same time, it's also a build, right? Because now you own all the
No, yeah,
code.
I was mostly I would characterize it as a build. Like
Oh,
the reason we buy it, like when I think build versus buy, I'm thinking buy to a third party provider that
mhm.
will operate it for me. Once you buy the company, it's literally your software to
Yeah,
maintain and develop. So I think of it as a build.
as you bought to build, essentially.
Well, no,
Yeah.
we it's an acquisition.
Right.
It's not what I would call a buy in the sense of what I think you mean when you say buy versus build.
Exactly. So you're absolutely correct there. Cool. This has been a lot of fun talking to you, Vincent. I think we always have a couple of wrap-up questions that we like asking our guests. To start, would love to know about something that you're excited about that you've been working on or maybe just enjoying. Yeah, if you could share a little bit about yourself professionally or personally that you're excited to share about.
So actually, the feature I'm most excited about these days, both as an individual consumer and as a business, is chatbots. So
Mhm.
I think it's not new to like most people by now, hopefully, who listen to this podcast have used ChatGPT. So think about how your search has evolved, right?
Mm,
And it doesn't meet all you need, but think about how the model has gone from you asking a question, getting a list of links, and finding the one where your answer may be, to asking a question and getting an answer to your question right straight away in plain English. The chatbot experience is going through that same concept. And
mm,
we do have a chatbot at Dialpad, and like we are building this LLM powered version, and it's that same leap in terms of how well it answers your question. And the reason
right.
I'm so excited about is that as a consumer, it is something that actually been close to for a long time. And it's always bugged me that very often you get better answer about by asking Google than
Yeah.
asking either the chatbot or the help center of the company for which product you have that question, right?
Mhm.
And I always thought this is crazy that I get a better answer from Google than from, say, Microsoft if it's an Excel question or I don't know, any
Yeah.
name your company. And I think what the LLM powered chatbot gives you is the ability to actually change that paradigm where you can get a chatbot to give you the acceptable answer. And that
Mhm.
becomes the reason why it's now much better provided by the company itself is that the knowledge base is much more constrained. So you don't get the hallucination that you would
Yeah.
risk if you were to ask ChatGPT or Vertex or any other LLM, like general purpose LLM out there.
That's fascinating. Chatbots are hot again. It was hot and then
Chatbots
it
are
wasn't
not
hot
bad.
and now it's
And
hot again.
hopefully, I think they're becoming actually super useful. So
Yeah.
I'm very
Do you
excited about that.
do you have a name for the Dialpad chatbot? Is there like a Clippy kind of naming convention going on here?
No, we're not. Well, I'm a big believer of if unless you have unlimited amount of PR and you Tesla, you can do whatever you want or Google, and every time you change something, people will amplify it. At our stage, like it's better if your name is obvious so that people don't spend time trying to figure out
Mhm.
what your product does. Chatbot is named AI chatbot
Yeah.
just because that's what it is.
I love it. This also reminds me of when we launched Uber Conference back in the day, and we always had to differentiate between Uber Conference and Uber, which is also taking off at the same time. We should have done a partnership there where people could have conference calls in the car
In
of an
the car.
Uber car. Cool. And then the last question we always love asking is share one product that you've either purchased or used recently that you either loved or would never buy again?
So I'm gonna actually move a little bit away from software because I feel like we're always being in Bay Area people, we tend to focus on software. And Rivian is actually a great experience. So I bought a Rivian SUV almost a year ago now,
Okay.
and it is very impressive. I'm so like I've been a Tesla fan, and I'm still a huge Tesla fan for
Hmm.
sure. I bought a Tesla, my first Tesla in 2013. So I was
Yeah.
one of the first 5,000, and I've seen how the company evolved over time, like amazing. But we have two dogs, and at some point, like we needed an SUV with a vertical window, and
Hmm.
Tesla doesn't have that. And Rivian was the most obvious. So once you've driven electric, I think it's very difficult to not like to move back to a gas powered car. And so
Yeah.
I bought a Rivian with a little bit of a question mark, thinking like Tesla sets the bar so high. There's been
Hmm.
so many EV companies that have gone nowhere. I'm like, but then we tried it. It was really good. And then after a year of ownership, I'm like, this is literally, it's same for most of what you want from Tesla. Then the build quality is better. And it's just an amazing, versatile car that does
Yeah.
everything you want. So very impressed. And it's good to know that even the number two in the space can have products that are as good as the number one in the space. So
Yeah, that's awesome. I secretly put down a reservation for Rivian, but I've yet to fully convince my wife that it's a good decision. So maybe I'll just play this clip on loop for her to say, "Hey, it's the best car out there. Once you drive electric, you can't go back." And then
just
finally,
love
I'll
it.
get it.
Come and visit.
I'm gonna hold you to that. I'll be down there in San Diego in 2 hours.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you, Vincent. It was a pleasure speaking to you and catching up. Always good reliving old stories in our time at Dialpad together. And I look forward to catching up again in the future. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. See you.
Thank you for listening. If you found this show valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or here on YouTube. We'd love if you could leave us a rating and or a review, as that helps others find this podcast. See you next time.